Hey, it's showtime. Welcome to another rousing adventure at Chill Skills, Sporlan Tech Talks. Thanks for joining us today. This is a special recorded presentation supporting the S3C Case Control prop line. If you're viewing this now, you may have already figured that out, right, John?
Potentially.
Here we are to explain how to program the set points for the S3C Case Controls for a specific store application. This presentation was originally targeted for the refrigerated case OEMs. However, we thought others would benefit from access to the information, so here it is. And now here's where you can go for additional S3C training information: the Sporlan training website and our YouTube channel. Please contact Sporlan's S3C support team if you have any questions at the end, and I'll tell you how to do that in just a few minutes. Hello, I'm Jim Jansen, Senior Application Engineer. That's me on the left. And that's kind of irrelevant since we're streaming our video images these days.
That's right.
Yeah. Senior just means I have a fair amount of gray hair and I've been around for a while. This guy over here who's joining me today.
I have gray hair too.
Yeah, not as much as I do.
Not yet.
Yeah, no, but we're working on it today, I think.
I'm getting there.
Yeah. John Whithouse. John's our longest running co-host. John's the Senior Principal Engineer for the Sporlan Division. He's a published author, consultant, and as I have said many times in the past, all-around extra smart guy. All this means John's a big deal around here. We're excited to have him with us today. Maybe you ought to say hi.
I probably should. Hello, everyone.
Yeah. And Phyllis is in the room. She's our communications director. She tells us what to do and when to do it, and every once in a while we'll pay attention to her. Contacting the S3C support team is the fastest way to get follow-up support. That's because that team supports primarily only the S3C series case controls. They know all the ins and outs of this specific product and can provide the assistance you need. Now, don't make the mistake of reaching out to any single individual member of that team here at Sporlan. The fastest way is to go through this channel because you never know when somebody might be on vacation or they might be sick. And if they're away from here, they're not going to have access to all the fancy stuff they need to help you troubleshoot your problem that you might have. Here's the phone number to contact. It's 888-920-6284. Here's the email to contact. It's mtsupport@parker.com. That is a little different email than what you normally see to access help from us, but that's what works. Now, don't be thrown off by this detail. If you call this 800 number or 888 number, that's going to contact you or connect you with our French Canadian friends. That would be up in Canada then, right, John? If they don't answer, you'll need to call back. If they do answer outside the hours that we've got here, and they will likely suggest that you call back during those posted hours. So what about the support timing? What about late night support timing? So from 1 minute past midnight.
Monday through Friday till 5 p.m. Eastern time, excluding holidays. So they're available through that whole time period for those overnight.
You bet.
Overnight services and change outs and system starts and things like that you typically have.
It's a big deal.
For large supermarkets, then they are available during those hours.
Now, that's not to say that we're not here to assist you with your normal air conditioning and refrigeration flow control needs for our legacy products, as you can contact tech support directly there at 636-392-3906, or you can send an email to svdtechsupport@parker.com. Here's a brief refresher. Remember the S3C case control? What does that mean, John?
That would have to do with safety, service, and security.
Yeah. Now, some of the things we're going to talk about today is that in most situations, the supermarket owner would provide case coil specifications to the manufacturer, and that manufacturer or original equipment manufacturer would then pre-program the set points into the appliances. What do I mean by appliances?
Refrigerated display cases.
Yes, that's code for that, I guess, right? To allow for a quicker startup at the supermarket. In other less common instances, the building automation system, or BAS, could maybe be used to send all set points to those devices after they have been identified or addressed appropriately. So what are ways the S3C can communicate with the BAS, John? There's two ways, I think.
It supports BACnet and Modbus protocols.
I can barely spell those words.
You did okay there.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, in part 3 of the S3C Series Case Controls webinar, we talked about accelerated case delivery and how to mount and wire the control. Here today, we've changed the terminology a bit in order to focus on accelerated case startup. Why is that a big deal, John?
Well, this concept of the accelerated case startup was really driven by the big box store type retailers.
Okay.
They need to be able to replace their old refrigeration or their old refrigerated cases, remodel or do a startup very quickly.
How quick?
A 1-day turnaround is kind of their ideal.
In the past, that might have taken as long as a week or longer.
Easily.
Well, in order to do this 1 day or less turnaround, controls need to be pre-programmed with application information, set points, the refrigerant in the system, defrost details, and so on.
Yep.
And this has got to be coordinated with the case equipment manufacturer for the pre-programming, implementation, testing, startup, with the end result being cool, cold, or frozen product ready to sell to customers in the shortest amount of time. And part of this process, well, it's really important to get the new cases not only in the store, but in the correct place with the correct programming for the cases to do their job. Sounds simple. Now, this accelerated case startup in today's supermarkets, we require fully pre-programmed and tested refrigerated cases. That means ready to be placed in the store and turned on with that goal of the 1-day startup for the store. To help with this in the beginning, Sporlan did what, John?
We talked directly with the case original equipment manufacturers, and that was to help understand their manufacturing processes, their programming, implementation, and then their testing and quality procedures for these items as they go out and before they ship out into the field.
Cool. Now, here's a list of the tasks that need to be completed by the refrigerated case manufacturer, the OEM. The cases will be wired and tested. The S3C control, or simply the control for short, will be configured with settings specific to each case, to each application. This includes, among other things we previously stated, the case identification or case ID. Presumably, no additional configuration effort on the part of the installing contractor would be required at the job site. The cases will ship to the store with the case identification attached to the case. Would that actually be?
So actual real placard or nameplate that would be attached somewhere on the front of the case so it's visible, clearly visible when the case is installed.
Now, sometimes that case ID gets formalized after the case has actually been set in the right spot. Is that right? The case will have an assigned location in the store based upon the case identification associated with it. And the case needs to be placed in that assigned location. And there's a couple of things that case ID includes. John, what are they?
So the two things are that placard and nameplate, and then the electronic entry for the control as part of the specific settings.
Okay.
And of course, they need to match. That kind of should go without saying.
But you know what? Sometimes they don't.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Now
that's a drawback.
That's a drawback. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, another thing, in order to facilitate pulling a vacuum on the system, this is on the actual, plumbing side of things. Prior to charging it with refrigerant, it's really handy to have all valves that are physically in the system in an open position. So that would mean all Sporlan EEVs, EPRs, and solenoid valves would be open. Now we ship the electronically controlled valves from our factory at a 50% open position. That helps somewhat. And what would you do like solenoid valves? If you don't have the case already wired up, how do you get those open?
if you don't have that little coil wired up so it can produce a magnetic force to open
Right.
the valve, well, maybe you need a magnet.
Oh, that'd be cheating.
It would. But who's counting?
Who's counting? If the case is wired and powered up, something called charge pro mode, which is part of the control scheme of the S3C, will force the step motor valves to 100% open and will also open the liquid line solenoid valve, including the circuit EEPR, if there is one there. Think that might help with charging the system?
It could. Yep. Everything wide open, it should charge rather easily.
Now, there's a few things that are required when programming the S3C. What are they? There's a short list here of some items.
Okay. So you do need to have the 24-volt DC power provided to the S3C. You'd have to have a Cat5 minimum Ethernet cable between the PC and S3C COM port. You need the predetermined store profile set point sheet and a PC, obviously a PC that's compatible.
Yeah, profile sheet. And what exactly is?
Okay,
we'll tell you in a minute. I didn't expect for you to answer that now, John. Now, there's also the power supply and the 2 Ethernet ports, and we're going to tell you a little bit of, here's an example of that necessary component, the DC power supply. So what does it do, John?
So basically that is a power supply that takes line voltage. In other words, in this case, anywhere from 100 to 240 volts AC, and outputs a nice, steady, controlled 24-volt DC output.
So this is just little fancy voltage transformer.
It kind of is, but it's good, clean DC voltage, well protected. That'll help protect the S3C from any kind of electrical interference or damage.
Good. Now, you'll need links to a OneDrive location for this next step, because we talked about this information you're going to need from us. This will provide access to some required files that the OEM is going to need to continue this process. And you'll need to contact your Sporlan field sales engineer in order to obtain that link so that you can get the file. We can't show the links here because that file will contain confidential information specific to the OEM and the store involved. However, the required links can be provided to any OEM currently deploying the S3C control package. Now, you may ask, what might you ask at this point?
Well, we've talked about this. Who is the Sporlan field sales engineer? Who is my Sporlan field sales engineer?
I'm glad you asked. And here are images of 4 of our very experienced Sporlan field sales engineers. These are some of the folks supporting our refrigeration OEM customers. Now, don't feel bad if you don't know who calls on your account. Sometimes I don't know either. Because of current business climate, change is happening on a rapid pace. So what do?
Changes happen.
Yeah. So here we've got Jason Alderman, a very experienced individual who's come to us from one of our big OEMs in the past, kind of like you did, John. And then Rolf, who's been with us for a good long time, very smart fella. And then Scott McKee, another excellent support staff. And of course, Sarah. Sarah is really doing a bang-up job out there. And you may recognize one of these individuals, but what if you don't? What if you don't know who calls on your account? Well, call 1-800-JERRY Wallach. What do you think about that? Would that work?
I'm not sure if I have that one programmed in my phone.
Jerry's our national sales manager, and while he would certainly know, there might be just a better way if you don't know who calls on your account. We're going to suggest that you call that.
We've seen that number before.
You've seen that number before. This is like deja vu all over again. 1-888-920-6284. That'll put you in the queue to get to an S3C team member that can answer that question for you. Now we get into some of the tough parts of this presentation.
The store profile sheet. That's the one you were trying to trip me up on a while ago.
Exactly, exactly. Now, prepare the local team that will be performing the programming by reviewing this documentation. This is a sheet or tab in the so-called workbook, which is simply an Excel file. The store workbook is the Excel file they obtained through the link we mentioned that you're going to get from the Sporlan field sales engineer, who they probably haven't seen in 3 years.
Oh, okay.
But I'm just kidding there. The sheet.
We just saw all four of them.
That's right. So it hadn't been 3 years.
It hadn't been 3 years.
And I can tell you what.
It's been like 1 minute.
Those four people can talk about a lot of things, not just Zoom log.
That's right.
Now, this sheet provides descriptions of the various parameters. Here's a little documentation flag right there. Moving on, there's the firmware update tab. Easy for me to say, huh? What does this ensure, John? What does this do for us?
Okay. So that will perform any necessary updates to the S3C Case Control firmware. And this is the program that utilizes set points to perform the function of the controller.
So you'd want to make sure that's been placed on a local drive. That means you save it on the darn computer or computers that you're going to use to program the S3C at your manufacturing location. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it, John?
Indeed, it does.
You might need to store this information on literally multiple PCs or laptops in your factory environment. And that would be after you got the file through use of the link that was provided to you by our Sporlan field sales engineer. And that becomes the so-called file path. When you're ready to update the controller, simply go here to firmware update.
Update firmware.
All sounds simple, doesn't it? Until you try to do it. You use your customers' specifications to enter appropriate data into the various fields under the name of each customer you service. Now, you create the appropriate customer name. What we have here in this example are fictitious examples, right? Keep in mind, Super One, Food Place, and Cold Foods are concocted supermarket store names for example purposes only.
I like them though.
You like those?
Yeah.
Of course, alone here, I've never figured that out. So I didn't have a clue what we were trying to convey there. Now, this list, of course, could continue on based on the limits of an Excel file, which almost definitely, or you can elect to create a file for each specific customer to keep them separate. Up to you. Yeah, you can use your own case model specifications to enter data into the various fields under the name of each model you manufacture. You create the case model name or names as it fits your needs during the programming process. Make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. You get to choose those as it makes most sense to your actual
lineup
installation. Lineup of product.
Now, the customer and case model info is available. You just need to add the specific profile information, such as case IDs, baud rate for the building automation system at the store. Defaults are available for many undetermined or unspecified parameters already built in. Once the complete profile for the case has been constructed, you're ready to push the set points to the controller. Push. So I'm like
push.
Yeah. Is that a generic term that everybody's supposed to understand, John?
Yes.
I guess that would mean an internet-based communication where the request for a given transaction is initiated by the publisher or control server.
Yes.
Everybody knows that. You select a case ID for the controller to which you're connected, then click Program Set Points box, which is
push equals send.
Why don't we just say that?
I don't know. Why didn't we say that?
Got to be fancy. If it all goes as planned, you'll get a result of passed. You can then print out the report as proof of work for that case. Sure sounds simple.
It does.
The installing contractors do not need to perform unnecessary work by changing modes of all the cases. But wait a minute, really what we mean to say is contractors should not be required to perform these tasks if the equipment manufacturer performs the aforementioned task ahead of time.
That's correct.
And they can make sure that temperature sensors, pressure transducers, expansion valves, all these things are functioning as intended. Now, the cases should arrive at the supermarket location in Charge Pro mode. We mentioned this earlier. Kind of feels like, again, deja vu all over again. What happens if they're not, John? What happens if they're in some other kind of mode? Can that happen?
It can, and that will result in extra work on the job site for the contractor.
So if they ship out like in the test mode that the OEM was using, which that does happen, just thwarts the functionality of the control, and prevents easy evacuation of the system, and continued process.
It's extra steps in the field where there is, as we already discussed, very little time to do that 1 day turnaround they're trying to achieve. Very little time for any extra steps.
And the cases will automatically go into the so-called refrigeration mode once the pressure transducers are exposed to approximately 5 psi. If you have prepared the set points for various appliances, and by appliances, we mean
refrigerated cases,
you don't need much more to perform the set point programming. Appliances, that's code for refrigerated cases. And what do you mean, don't need much of what? What do you need?
You need that unique case ID. You need a customer, case model, and a store case ID.
And there's probably some extra stuff that's really good to have, like that.
That we already mentioned, but we'll say it again. 24-volt DC power supply, S3C case controller, a Cat5 minimum cable, PC with store profile sheet. That would be that MSXL file. And as mentioned, Cat5 is the minimum there. Cat6 and 7 cables fine as well. So
awesome. Now, you should also obtain and use the latest version of the store profile sheet available from Sporlan. And where do you find that from Sporlan? We told you that earlier in the presentation, right? You're going to get that from that link that our Sporlan field sales engineer is going to provide to you. And if you don't know who calls on your account, you call that support number that we provided to you earlier. It should be a goal of every case OEM to load the latest firmware and use the latest store profile sheet to reduce startup time at the supermarket location and reduce the burden on the technicians after startup, because they're in a mad rush to get this operating again once they get the store to work on it. Now, here's an extra slide for reference. In a previous webinar, we talked about mounting and wiring some of the associated devices for this neat control package. And so here are some suggested locations for some components. What are they, John?
So you would have the power supply,
which is
over there.
It looks like that.
Over there. The valve module next to it. The S3C case control itself. Then up on the canopy, you have the display module. And typically that S3C case control, the valve module, the power supply, and even the display module would be factory installed by the case manufacturer. There have been times when the display module needs to be field installed.
Gotcha. And then we've got the liquid line solenoid valve and the EEPR over here as well. Now here's another extra slide for reference. You might remember in a previous presentation, we talked about communication loops. Here's additional detail showing the connections between the building automation system and the gateway routers, SGR in the diagram, sometimes simply referred to as cellular gateways, and the individual case controls. Note there's length limitations. Here we see 328 feet repeated. A network switch, which is another type of router. That's what we show right here, which can act as a necessary booster if the cable length exceeds the 328 feet. And also notice the options for the SGR or cellular gateway router, if you will, that can be placed in this position are here as well. Now there is a limit of 38 or less cases per communication loop, and this has something to do with the brand of the building automation system that's being used. Most building automation systems have 4 or more communication loop connection points, and we're going to talk more about this in just a minute. Now, why do we do all this? Why do we talk about all this? Because it speeds up the installation process and allows backnet communications to work so stores may be monitors, and we get it done as quick as possible. It takes a team, all of us working together. Now, here's additional detail showing the connections between the BAS, the cellular gateways, the gateway routers, and the individual case controls. Note those length limitations are repeated here. A network switch, we talked about that earlier, and the limit of 38 or less cases per communication loop, but also we've added some extra detail. There's a maximum of 32 on this, depending upon the brand of BAS that's being deployed, 38 on others. And just so you know, known up to this point, the case ID is a critical factor. If the wrong case is placed in the location, simply renaming the case ID doesn't mean that case was designed for that specific application, like that required temperature, defrost cycles, the whole works. Some cases are essentially duplicates of one another, except for some application details, but not always.
Right.
In order to meet any quick turnaround and startup goals, cases need to be placed in their assigned locations with the correct programming in place. Note the maps pin icon here that we've added to this slide, emphasize that fact. The so-called one-line drawing typically details the exact case location, like the drawing we've got here. Dimensional drawings may not denote those specific case locations. Now, here's an extra slide for some reference purposes. When we talk about the case ID needs to be consistent with the case label, the placard you talked about earlier, John, and the case placement. Did you hear me call it a place? I said place instead of case.
I was going to let that pass.
Yeah, were you? Yeah. In the store floor area. Is this a big deal?
It is actually.
So how would you go about determining the case ID?
Okay. You can use the Tech Check app, or you can use the display module, either one, to determine what the case ID is.
Well, it would probably be a really good idea to talk through that whole process. And we're going to do that very soon, but we're just not going to do it today.
Not today.
If the case gets placed incorrectly, and that can happens more than I'd like to admit, what are some options?
You can move the case. That's an option. You can actually just relocate the control. You can unplug it and reinstall it on the right case. Or you can reconfigure the control.
That sounds tricky.
It does, and time consuming.
So how would you go about that if you were going to take that approach?
Well, you're going to likely need help from our S3C tech support team if you're going to reconfigure the control, if that's the approach you take.
Well, what if the control is incorrectly configured in the first place, or not configured at all?
Well, it can generally be reconfigured at the job site. Shouldn't need to do that, but our tech support team can help with this as needed.
And that's the team that you'd contact by calling the 888 number
That's
that we've
correct.
mentioned a couple of times.
Yep, that's correct.
And that's why we're going through this whole presentation today, to help make sure the control is indeed correctly pre-programmed and configured in the first place. Right?
That's right.
Here's a detailed view of the lineup. For example, we got the dairy case lineup, and we can have a maximum of 8 shared cases. What does that mean, shared cases? What
Okay, so they can have a lot of the same settings, same defrost settings, same evaporator pressure, temperature control, things like that.
And then again, note that depending upon the BAS manufacturer, we got a limitation.
32 on that particular manufacturer.
Now let's take a look at this. here's an even more detailed example of the communication loop and the lineup together with dairy cases, meat cases, and even remote condensing units being depicted. Again, we note 32 devices on a loop with this BAS and 38 on this manufacturer's. And John, I hate to say it, but we're just about to wrap up the technical part of this presentation. I mean, I was hoping to stay here for another hour or two, weren't you?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Great
Oh,
chairs.
one more thing. Look at this. I snuck this in. Yeah, see, I surprised you there, didn't I?
You did.
In a situation where multiple comm loops are connected to a single building automation system, you got the RS485 cable that's connecting that BAS to the control ahead of the lead case on each loop, and they get assigned a unique number to satisfy the building automation manufacturer. Now, by default, Sporlan S3Cs have an RS48485. I'm having trouble with that, John. 485.
RS485.
Yeah. Address of number 7, like we show right there.
Mm-hmm.
On the Novar BAS, each communication loop needs to be uniquely identified. You start with 7 and work your way up the number scale. Again, by default, all Sporlan S3Cs start with 7. The Emerson BAS is somewhat simplified versus the Novar. Now, don't take me wrong. We're not promoting one over the other in any way, shape, or form.
Nope.
Each comm loop there could be identified with the default 7 with no problem. Just be careful if there are multiple comm loops terminated on the same comm port, like on the Emerson, each there would need to have a unique identity. You can't do this at all on the Novar version. The Sporlan Tech Check mobile app for iOS allows technicians to change that address and then perform a reset. And we're going to talk about the Sporlan Tech Check mobile app in a future
video.
And finally, where can I go to learn more about this stuff? That's a great question. If you want even more information, look at the Sporlan YouTube channel. I think we even got a QR code. I think that might even actually work.
Wouldn't that be cool?
Literally. And finally, my new favorite part of these webinars are presentations as the case may be, and this is really not a webinar. The frequently asked part. Was this webinar, our presentation, recorded? Well, heck yes, it was.
I hope it was.
Yeah, it was recorded. That's all. This is a recorded one. We're not even streaming this one live.
Because if not, we're doing this all for nothing.
Yeah, we're doing this all for nothing. So I hope they hit the record button on this deal. And here's specific documents that you can find online that can be a great big help to you, ranging from Bulletin 100-50-9 to all kinds of literature that's available for various products, including what we discussed today. And then just a little reminder, we got the S3C Case Control support team. There's the hours that they're working. There's the phone number. There's the email address.
And yeah, that picture looks just like those guys too.
It does, exactly. Yeah. And then you have questions about legacy products. Here's where to go for that as a reminder. And you want to know even more, you can go to sporlan.com. You can access all kinds of tech support, videos, product literature, other training, and our virtual engineer software sizing and selection tool. And you can stay connected to us with things like Facebook, and you can read blogs and do all kinds of neat things. And we really would like for you to sign up for the Chili News. You can do that. This kind of instructs you how to do that. And then you'll be notified the next time we do one of these shindigs, like a webinar.
You know what? I'd almost bet that QR code works too.
I'm hoping. And darn, John, this concludes the presentation.
Once again, we reached the end.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.